Okay, we're live. Welcome to Dive into Worldbuilding. And today we're talking about naming. This is a topic that we have talked about before, but I was thinking, gee, it'd be really cool if we could try to get a little bit of extra perspective on this, maybe some insights that we haven't had before, because naming is a super complicated topic. And yes, I definitely want to. Well, I have a bunch of stuff written down that I want to talk about. But I think the first thing that I want to talk about is something that was mentioned right at the end of our last conversation about naming, which was some while ago. And that was something called the Atlas of True Names. Now, the Atlas of True Names is basically like an online atlas, map of, regions of the world, where all of the names of the places have been etymologized, and they're trying to get back to the original core
meanings
of the words that have become these names.
So almost every river in Britain is the River Water, for example.
Like that, yes, like that. And I don't want to comment on the Atlas of True Names itself, because I haven't done enough research to be able to comment on the quality of their translations. But I do think that that's a really interesting place to start, because a lot of names are extremely literal when they're first awarded to something. And then over time, they lose that meaning and they just become a series of syllables associated with a thing or a place or a person. Does that make sense? So this is sort of a process. It's funny, because if you look at Tolkien, for example, all the Elven names have literal meanings in Elvish, right? That are easily translatable if you just bother to take the time. Which I always thought was really kind of interesting. When we have names in the real world, they tend to be a few more layers further away, right? A good portion of the time. I'm not going to say all of the time. I mean, we have friends who have literal names that mean literal things in English. But I mean, baby naming books would not be quite so big and complex if it weren't for the fact that there is a big divorce between the origins of a name and its later usage. So, thoughts on that?
Yeah, just touching on the rivers in England thing.
Yes.
There are a ton of rivers in England which are literally named after the local word for water, usually of Celtic origins, but many of them have slightly migrated in pronunciation and so forth. So the depending which Celtic language you're talking of, but basically the word for water is uisci. That whiskey is literally water. And so we have the rivers Usk, we have the river Esk, we have the river Axe, we have the river.
Oh, I lost you, Brian.
X. They are all based. They would only have one river nearby, so it would just be the river or the water.
Yeah.
So the vast majority of these still have that name, but there aren't that many. There are like I can think of only 2 or 3 river Esks, 1 river Usk. So they've, by having those different pronunciations or local elisions of how they are termed, we actually don't have what appears to be a vast number of duplications, but they really are all kind of based on the original term. Avon as well. So we have a couple of river Avons, and Avon means water. We have some rivers that are not named after water, but not too many.
Avon, Stratford-on-Water.
Well, as opposed to a Stratford on a different river. You have to distinguish these things.
Well, Stratford, of course, is going to have the meaning of ford, right? The
So
place
what
where
is
you can
Strat?
cross the river.
So it's the straight ford across.
I'm not absolutely sure of the strat, whether it is straight or not. But yes, fords were obviously a very useful thing when you had rivers. So you would towns would mostly spring up around fords or bridges, places you could manage to easily cross. And yes, we have again place names that are totally descriptive of what happened at the time that they were coming into existence. So we have two Newcastles. We have Newcastle upon Tyne, which is the one that's named for the river it sits on, and we have Newcastle under Lyme, which is named for whatever the Lyme is, and I don't even know. There isn't, to my knowledge, a hill or river or place or whatever, but it's Newcastle under Lyme. That's how you tell them apart. That's Lyme, Lyme, for good measure. We do not have Limes, Lime, because although we are Limeys, the Lyme is a much later acquisition.
I looked up Stratford. So basically, Stratford is a combination of the Old English strat, meaning street, and ford, shallow part of it. So it's where the street crosses the river.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which you could apply to almost any town that had a street and a river in it.
Hence, there being Stratfords on a bunch of rivers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so yeah, and it's really interesting how you get these literal descriptions of places and things that turn into names that then become unparsed later. You guys know the word unparsed, right? Because a parsing is breaking something apart and turning it into its components.
Right.
So later on, we lose that meaning that was originally literal. And I always think that's kind of interesting because, so for example, I had a history teacher in high school named Mr. Sturch. And I called him Mr. Sturch for so long that it was almost unparsed. It was like, who is he? He's Mr. Sturch. It was like this single unit. And I had no concept that, there was a level on which I had no concept that he might have a first name, for example. And then I graduated and he was like, call me Nicholas. And I was like, I don't know how. Because it had just sort of embedded itself in my brain as this single unit.
Yeah. And when he said that, he changed the context. He said, okay, the context of our relationship is different. So I'm going to ask you to use a name that goes with the new context or the change in context, but it's not that easy. It's not, and there wasn't really a firm new context because it was the end of the high school context, not a specific new context. It wasn't as though you were now colleagues or friends or family or something that has a specific form for how you talk to people, what you call people. So
people definitely change their names over time or over context. So part of context is when you're using the name, right? Context includes who's saying the name and who's hearing it.
Because
we've lost meaning
and when it is said.
Over time, we don't even think about names that are familiar to us. We probably all know somebody called, I don't know, Carpenter or Fletcher or Smith.
Yeah,
they are not usually Carpenters, Fletchers, or Smiths. We have totally divorced the origin of the name from.
Oh yeah, I know a lot of people who don't even know the meaning of the word Fletcher. They just think it's a last name.
Yeah, that's right. And there's quite a lot of those. That where the jobs have effectively become extinct. We don't have a lot of people whose job is cartwright these days, but there are still plenty of people called cartwright. And carter, somebody who drives a cart. All of these, it occurs in multiple languages as well, certainly around Europe, and I don't know much beyond that. But again, there are tons of German names that derive from the profession that, when they started having to distinguish people apart, Johann, that's Johann the Schmidt. He's the smith, that's his job. And you tell him apart from one of the other Johanns, because as you get more and more people in one place, you can't keep signifying by first name, especially when you're drawing from a really small pool of first names, which a lot of European countries certainly did, much less so now. But there's a depressingly small number of names recorded in early medieval English history. There's so many damn Rogers and Williams and so forth, and so very few most other things.
So I was thinking about first names that have literal meanings. For example, Faith. You'll see people who are called Faith, people whose name is Faith. It's a word.
Faith,
what it means.
hope, charity.
But then if you have, it's not just a word, it's a concept that it's known in many, many cultures, and cultures that have different languages. So, for example, Imani is not an English word. It's not an English name, but it translates to faith. So then there are names that have meanings that translate in English to multiple words, like God is my light. There's a lot of words for a name in English, but in Hebrew, it's just one.
So speaking of names with meanings, Ellis Island had a big effect on names, especially among Jewish immigrants. There are a lot of Goldsteins and Silversteins and whatnot, because you would come off the boat and they would say, and the rumor was going around that they only wanted certain professions, and you were likely to be let into this is early 20th century. You would be more likely to let into the country if you were like a smith of some kind of a gold worker or a silver worker, someone with that skill set. So you'd come off the boat and they would say an English name, and people gave their profession because they thought that was what they were asking, right? And so they got named Goldsmith or Goldstein or Silversmith or something like that, when that wasn't their name at all. Or in other cases, it was just the name, but it got mangled in some anglicized way because the people at Ellis Island couldn't be bothered to learn how to properly spell names that were Russian or Germanic or whatever. And so
well,
it became a kind of a power thing.
Well, I think that's actually a really interesting point. Just because I tend to think that names are an enormous gold mine of like historical Easter eggs for any secondary world, right? If you have the option, don't just make them up. Or while you're making them up, retcon a whole bunch of stuff. Like, figure out how to learn whether there was, I have not seen an Ellis Island that I can recall in a work of speculative fiction. Have you guys seen anything like that?
No, really not as a secondary world.
To see, here's this port where everybody who comes through, their name gets changed by like, hey, okay.
Yep.
In thinking about it, when since you've got potentially not just different human languages, but different species with different physical linguistic capabilities, the options for morphing are just enormous. And what I was going to say about our Ellis Island is that it's not just, yes, the power thing is absolutely there, but as far as spelling goes, you're going from people who may or may not be reading and writing in Cyrillic to someone who's well, if they're actually writing the names down, they're probably reading and writing in the Roman alphabet.
Well, if they're from Poland or Germany, they would have a proper Latin spelling. But if they're Jewish, they're probably used to writing their name in Hebrew alphabet,
Which is even more fun. So if you're going,
but they would know the proper Latin spelling if they're from Germany or Poland or any place that was basically settled or conquered by the Catholics rather than the Orthodox Church, right? That's the division between Cyrillic and
but
Latin.
there were still local variations across all of the Slavic regions about how they would transliterate those names.
but you're also dealing with accent.
There's also the fun that I have a huge problem in the US when I come across a lot of names because I don't know how to pronounce them, because I know how they are pronounced as if they were originally Polish names or German names or Italian names. And most of the time, they are in fact not pronounced like that anymore. And I don't know how to address people because I don't know how closely they've held on. Some people do. Some names do.
I had a lot of trouble when the Mueller investigation started, not saying Mueller, right? Because he spells it with the U, with the UE, right? Which is like a U umlaut.
Yeah, that's not a transliteration of a U and umlaut, so he should be Müller.
And I knew a guy whose last name was Marquis, but it was spelled Marquis, right? And so he had to tell me how to pronounce his name. Another, of course, obvious and even more pernicious than Ellis Island, which was often just sort of casual racism and laziness, was the forced changing of names of African slaves in America, giving them Anglo names, giving them last names, which is, of course, why Malcolm Little changed his name to Malcolm X, right? And it was pernicious for both first names and last names got replaced. But even their descendants, they had the last names of whatever the slave owners had given their ancestors.
Sometimes they have the last names of the slave owners too.
Yeah, right. This kind of like name branding in a way, right? And so
using names to depict ownership.
Yes. So I mean that's a thing. Names, and then of course he changed his name again when he converted to Islam, right? But that was
religious
wrong.
conversions often lead to changes of name or additional names.
Yeah. If you look at children who, I was given an English name and a Hebrew name. My child only has Hebrew names used for daily use and religious use, but also they have chosen to use a different name, having made the discovery that they are non-binary. So the feminine name is not something they're comfortable with.
Sure.
Saints' names, multiple names. Another thing that you deal with in terms of coming to a place like Ellis Island or having someone else put your name down where other people are going to be getting it, which is basically it's a third-party introduction to your name. Instead of saying directly, this is my name, and then to the person who's going to be using it. With the census taker, the immigration officer is the person who's saying, you tell me your name and I will tell the rest of the world. A thing that you're dealing with, not just the letters, but the accents and any hesitation. My grandmother's name is down on the ship's manifest as Emily, probably because her mother hesitated when she was saying Millie. Millie.
Right? Then all of a sudden, what happened?
Okay, no, that's
and then there's like, for example, Buddy Holly, right? whose name is not his birth name. His first
Stage
name
names,
was
yeah.
Charles, and Holly was misspelled by accident when they printed the label for his first single, so he was stuck with it for his whole career. They dropped an E. You know, there's that happens. I seem to recall that Ulysses S. Grant was given a new middle name because West Point they wrote down the wrong middle initial for him, and that was that.
I think we're it's worth mentioning that we're talking about a larger pattern here, which is that there are certain kinds of times and events in life that are associated with getting names, and a great many of them have to do with our social affiliations.
Right. I mean, in the Catholic tradition, getting a middle name upon being confirmed.
Sure. And in the Jewish tradition, a girl is named at 8 days and traditionally not spoken of by her name until the naming ceremony, you know, which was a way of coping with infant mortality back in the day. It's very practical.
Yeah. So I think it's important to explore this thing, because a lot of these, you know, a lot of these things that we've just been mentioning, like the Ellis Island situation, where you're entering a new social community and that social community wants to know what to call you and wants to be able to decide what to call you, right?
Doesn't want to learn how to pronounce your name properly.
Right, because you're not part of the old community anymore, so they don't care because racism, etc.
Yep.
Right? But now that you're part of our community, we get to decide how to call you, etc. You know, or I'm converting to a religion. What is going to be the way that I'm called in this community? Gender identity is also a huge one. You know, re-entering the community under different terms, maybe would be a way of describing that. I just think that the social affiliations of names are really key, and so it's worth thinking about those.
And titles too, right? Like
titles too,
if
sure.
you're in the South and you're a white male, who is very well respected, you become colonel, whether or not you were ever a colonel. And that's a thing. Like in my Gharana or musical household, when I studied North Indian classical music, which I still do, my teacher, you know, had the title of Ustad, which means a maestro who happens to be Muslim, and you know. They would add Saab, which is an honorific that you tack onto a last name. And so he was either called he would be on posters. He would be like, for his concerts, it'd be Ustad Ali Akbar Khan Saab or Ustad Ali Akbar Khan. And we would call him Khan Saab or Baba, which means father, because the Gharana is structured like a family. And you have senior students are Dada or Didi, which is older brother or older sister. And things like that. And so you would know their names. It's, you know, a bit like dealing with, say, the royal family or in England or something. You know what their names are, but you don't ever, you know, no one ever calls Her Majesty Elizabeth Windsor, right? Like that would not occur to
well, that's for sure.
right? Even though that would probably what it says on her birth certificate.
Yeah, like in a lot of Shakespeare plays where you get like George, Duke of Clarence, he keeps getting called Clarence. There's really George.
Right.
I noticed something though while we were talking about names. We were talking about first names and last names, and yeah, we talked about how some last names are occupations or locations, but this isn't the structure. And we're talking about naming human beings. We haven't talked about naming
We could talk about the naming of cats. It's a serious
serious business.
No. We only have
just one of your holiday games.
We only have half an hour left, though. but talking, you know, not everybody uses the family name as a surname.
Sure.
Sometimes there are family names that come before the individual name, or clan names. And if you've got, if you've got a whole different.
This. This is actually, here's a little tidbit that's related to what you're saying, Morgan. The Japan, just like within the last month, requested that American news organizations use the Japanese name ordering for the prime minister. Rather than using the American name ordering. So American name ordering being like first name, last name, right? And we've done that with the Japanese prime minister for years on end, despite the fact that nobody does that in Japan. Your last name, your surname always comes first, right? Sure. And for the Chinese folks, we've been doing the surname, first name thing for a while. But not with Japan for some reason, and they just in fact requested that we change it.
Cool. Yeah, the names in Henry Lian's Pea Sprout Chen series are very, very cool, and he's written about them. Like the Pea Sprout personal name was one he made up, right? Like, and her brother's name as well, and he wanted certain things out of that. And he's written about that, and then he's got, you know, sort of a Chinese culture and sort of a Japanese culture in the books, and they have different naming conventions. And like Pea Sprout's name seems very rural and kind of hickish to the people in Pearl City. So, and then you can see that reaction. Another secondary world where I love the names is obviously Middle Earth, because Tolkien created whole languages so that his names would make sense in those languages.
Yeah,
right?
I mentioned that briefly at the start because of the fact that they all have literal meanings.
Yeah.
Right.
And they have multiple names, like Gandalf was Aloran, or Gandalf or Mithrandir. Morgoth was originally Melkor. Who was Sauron's old boss, right? When he was good, he was Melkor, but when he turned to evil, when he turned to the dark side, like Darth Vader, he got a new name.
Well, exactly. He converted.
Yeah, he did.
Here's the thing. I was thinking of names. I'm reading. I'm actually reading one of Julie Trinita's books, and we don't always talk about spoken versus written, and we just assume that our names, you write your names. We've talked about writing them down now, you know, spelling them, and spelling only matters if you're writing something down.
Usually in a book, you've written something down now.
Yeah.
Well, there is that. There's the
about
restrictions of the medium.
Yes.
Yeah. And if you're talking about putting something into a computer system or a form, then you run into the problems that we just talked about with structure and placement of family names.
And the programmer's assumptions about what a name contains. Like, for example, a first name, one middle name, and a last name.
Which does not fit.
A lot of people don't fit into that.
Because I'm looking at a list of names of characters in my current work in more or less progress. And there are family names and personal names and guild names and home names, and they multiple patterns that aren't going to fit into any one form. And that's a thing that you can think about when you're doing your secondary world and your island is, you know, do you have a government that is willing to work with this, or one that is going to say you have to fit this into our mold?
Arkady Martin's A Memory Cold Empire has really interesting names in the Empire. Everyone's name has a number and then a noun. And there are, as is explained throughout the text, that there are some portentous reasons to choose one number or another. Some are very simple and straight, like 1 or 2, and others are completely ostentatious, like 17. So you can get a name like 17 Waterfall or 3 Seagrass. And she has fun with criticizing and thinking about the names within the text as people are introduced, as this character who's an ambassador from outside the Empire is introduced to various people and only has like a vague knowledge of what these names actually could possibly mean. It's a really rich way of looking at, because it's and they sometimes have other names they call each other. So there's a whole sorts of layers of what do you call a particular person and in what context. It's really fascinating.
So I have a couple of things that I want to say vis-a-vis this. One is that is really astute. Just by hearing a name, we learn a ton about somebody's social affiliation. And I think we underestimate how often that happens. Like, so for example, race in the US is a huge divider, and very often you can tell what kind of racial community or ethnic community a person comes from just by hearing their name, because certain types of name choices will be made in certain types of communities. Now, that's not always predictable, because there are some names that are, say, for example, archaic in one community, but current in another community. And it can cause all kinds of funny reactions from people when they're not thinking outside the box and they may not be expecting it, right? Wait, that name's super archaic or whatever. And oh, in fact, no, it's totally normal for somebody to be called that in this other community. So you can play around with that, and it's really hard to create an entire naming history for a secondary world. I mean, I encourage you to do it, by all means, go for it if you want to. But so, for example, I have a character by the name of Piaris who goes undercover. Basically, he pretends he's a member of another caste and meets somebody, and then this person decides that she's going to go looking for him later. And so she mentions it to one of her friends, and her friend's like, oh, I didn't know that was a name of somebody from our group. And she's like, well, yeah, evidently, right? Because she doesn't know that he was in disguise, right? So I just kind of wanted to sort of nod at that as I was writing it, because that is definitely a thing, right? You as a reader, you wouldn't have any idea of that. But what I was trying to do, and it sounds like that Arkady Martin is trying to do, is to create the sense that that structure is there by showing a character thinking about it.
Yes, exactly.
So I think that's kind of cool. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, which we've never talked about to my knowledge, is signatures. And it occurred to me when you were talking about written forms of the name, right?
Yeah.
Signatures are really important, but we don't get a lot of advice on them that I know of. I mean, how many people have been advised on their signatures here? Because I don't feel like I ever was.
Growing up, I was told I have bad penmanship and a bad signature. But I was in 3rd grade. So,
like, oh, here's what you should strive to achieve with your signature. No, I don't think there's a lot of discourse around that.
No, individual letters, not the signature.
Can you say it again, Paul?
Yeah, I was advised on individual cursive letters because, you had the thing, but not the actual form of the signature. No one told me I should do this or not do this. So I've always done my signature with a P not connected to anything else, because that's the way I liked it, but no one told me differently.
So when I was a little kid, I thought my signature was too legible, and I wanted it to be more like my parents' signatures. So I deliberately obfuscated it so that it would look more adult to me. This was like 2nd, 3rd grade. My dad was an executive in the 1980s, and I'm sorry about the phone ring, in the 1980s, and they had a big part of the hiring process was signature analysis, which was this crackpot, you know,
yeah. Handwriting analysis generally, I think, too.
Yeah, it was signature handwriting analysis, especially handwriting, which was a quack theory about, and you wanted strong leaders, so they couldn't have weak handwriting, right? That was a thing. And then there's like, you know, what constitutes a signature, whether or not it's just a written signature, or whether it's, you know, like kanji plus a stamp, or whether it's a signet ring, which, you know, only one person has access to, except usually, you know, the executive who works for that person also has access to it and has empowered to use the king's signet ring or the queen's signet ring.
Yeah. So hanko are what they use in Japan. And you need to get one made because written signatures are not acceptable. Which I found very interesting. I didn't have to sign a whole lot of things, but my husband did. So he had a
one
little, you know,
oh, that's cool,
stamp that says Uedo on it.
in katakana, or
in katakana, yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we still have it somewhere here. Next time you come by, I'll show it to you.
Yeah.
Have you been practicing your new signature, Juliet?
I have been practicing a new signature because I suddenly realized I'm going to have a book that I should be able to sign.
Yep.
Yeah.
So do not use the signature you sign checks with to sign everybody's books with.
Well, you know, I don't want to have the same signature to sign bank documents with that I'm going to sign books with, right? I don't want to have the same signature to just sort of sign my name with on any old thing.
Can I make a recommendation?
You know, what?
Make it short.
Make it easy.
Yeah. Because
well, you know, actually,
the only autograph situation that I've been in was sort of a for the release of the book that my short story was in, and there were a bunch of us lined up, you know, just a table, and they would just pass the books down the row, and so I would get the book from the person on my left who had just signed, and I would have to sign it and then pass it to the person on the right. And, you know, the person on my left, I think, had initials and a short name. So he's just going, and I'm just, the books are piling up, and I'm trying to write legibly, you know, my signature, Morgan S. Brilliant, and this is not working. And then I realized that it's just getting scrawly, and I have to stop and reset. But I still have these, you know, 6 letters and an initial, and then 9 letters, and it just make it short because your hand will start to cramp.
Well, so it's interesting because I've seen people just sort of turn their signatures into a really simple sort of squiggle with structure, right?
Yeah.
But not with the letters.
But it's a repeatable object
that it follows, but it becomes a sort of a visual object rather than a series of letters. I've seen that approach. The other approach that I've seen is writing all the letters of your name.
That was my approach. So first of all, my for legal signatures, I do Clifford J. But I decided to have my byline be Cliff so that I wouldn't be called Clifford at cons for the rest of my life. Was the basic reasoning there. And so I have to sign it Cliff. I had to learn how to do that.
Yeah.
And then I had to unlearn the illegible signature because I wanted people to be able to read my signature in their book. So I had to learn how to do it legibly. So it looks very different than like when I write a check.
Well, I think it's interesting to consider why people would write their names differently, right?
My wife, who is an MD, has absolutely a completely illegible signature. That is like one of those. It's like one of those glyphs that you were talking about for some writers.
I think glyphs are cool. I mean, so everybody's got their own approach. I know that Alethea Contis spends a great deal of time on her signatures and has a very beautiful calligraphic style. But not only that, she does illustrations around it. And that is its own form of choice. Now, if you're you know, in a line of signers, that's gonna hold up the line. But at the same time, I mean, it's a choice. You don't have to, you know, you don't have to speed it up just because people around you are going faster. Yeah. So anyway, but I mean, you can actually play around with your signature, and I think, have you guys played around with your signature? It sounds like Cliff has.
Because I just
you know, my last name has 2 consonants and then has an I in the middle. And when I'm signing a book, I make sure I have the right number of humps, right? so that it's legible, right? And that takes a little extra time. Like, you know, when I'm doing a bank thing, I'm just kind of like, you know, whatever. It's like a wave function. My dad's signature is like a W line G with 2 dots, because he was an executive, had to sign a lot of documents. And as an MD and working in ER, Deborah has to do that too.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I have some ideas, but I did want to tell you that. So I changed my signature when I got married. Because I decided to take my husband's name, but I didn't want to lose my other name, which meant I ended up with 3 middle initials. And my signature had previously had both of my middle initials in it, and now it was going to have 3, and I thought, this is getting a bit ridiculous. But what I did was I actually played around, and I designed a sigil that included all 3, so that I could quickly include all 3.
Nice.
Yeah, well, you know, it took some time to find a way that was going to make me happy, but I would, you know, in the end, I became quite happy with it. I was like, oh, okay, cool, this works, and I still use it to this day. But that's not a thing that belongs in a book signing signature. So now I'm playing.
Well, yeah, married names is another thing. Did you talk about that before? Sorry, I didn't interrupt. Did you talk about that before I joined married names?
Nope.
Right? You know, like
names.
I recently read an article about this one. It was like published in the early 20th century, right? And she had accomplished, I don't even remember what. She was like being honored for her accomplishments to the community, and she was clearly a leader and clearly someone with her own mind. Throughout the entire article, she was Mrs. her husband's name. Like, I never knew what her name was reading the whole article.
Yeah.
Right? Like, her identity was completely subsumed. Because she was married. And I like the present situation where it's an option, where people, like, you know, can opt. Yeah. And like Rachel Swirsky's husband, I believe he goes by Mike Swirsky is her name, you know, often. So I think that's great. I think, you know, it's lovely.
Yeah.
Well, you call it an option, but the custom still is in this country for children to have their father's name. So a woman who chooses to keep her father's name is going to have a different name from her children.
Yes, which is one of the reasons Debbie took my last name, is for convenience. And there's absolutely sexist, and there's the history of that. I do know some people who their children got a hyphenated name. So, like, the father's name was Waxberg, the mother's name was Bob, last name Bob, and the kids are the Bob Waxbergs.
Yeah.
One of them is Raphael Bob Waxberg, who created BoJack Horseman. But anyway.
So then that's a thing to look at with names, is what is the point of a surname, of a family name? Is it to identify the current unit that, you know, the parents and the children who are being raised by those parents? Is it to keep a history of the lineage which is why you have your father's name, your father's name, your father's name, and you hyphenate, and that way you get to keep one partner's father's name and the other partner's father's name.
Right.
But what happens when that child who has these two fathers' names wants to form a family with someone else who has someone's father's names?
Right. And I've seen people do things where they combine the two names in a way where they kind of break them up and mix them together.
But
Yeah,
then
After the
you
hyphenation
direct line
got a little, long.
Yeah, but
Right.
then you have a direct line between that name and the prior family. So what is the purpose of the surname? What is your reason for keeping a particular name? And that is a thing. I don't have an answer. I'm not actually.
Yeah. No, but it's a good thing to
think about.
ask.
It varies culturally. If you look at how Spanish names, the full names of Spanish people include surnames of both parents and so forth, and there are ways of linking back. So full Spanish names are extremely long. I have a lot of issues with names. I work for an international payroll company. We have payrolls that we run in over 70 different countries, and so we see a lot of different naming conventions and standards. To be honest, the only place that we did come across that really doesn't work for having a first or personal identifier name versus and a surname or family name is Indonesia, where names are almost completely random. They may have one or more components, and they bear no relation from one person to another, even in the family unit, as far as I can tell. There may be subtleties that I don't know about in terms of different ethnic or cultural groups in Indonesia, but Indonesian names are just difficult to deal with from a Western perspective. That was the only place that we really have significant issues. Everywhere else broadly does tend to fall into having an individual signifier and a group signifier, if you will. But yes, what that group is can vary. We had friends who, when they got married, they changed their surnames. They didn't take each other's surnames. They combined the elements of both previous surnames into one and shared that new surname. Not hyphenating, but actually creating a new name.
Right, and I think what that does is it tells us which groups people are, people consider important. I mean, so in our world, we are accustomed to having surnames in our world. What am I saying? In our cultural tradition, we're generally, there's that sort of idea of a lineage, and we've got this idea that you need to signify that lineage with a name as your group signifier, right? But then there's, I believe, the Sikh community, where basically if you are a man and a Sikh, your last name is more regularized. Am I right? It's like Singh.
Singh.
You always include Singh in the name. It doesn't necessarily have to be considered your surname.
There you go. So that's an additional group signifier that may, depending on the context, that may be the only thing that you hear, or there may be other layers of significance added in there. But I find that interesting.
I find interesting the whole idea that it's assumed that you call people by their family name first, and then if you get to know them well, then you can call them by their personal name.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to think of novels where that's the reverse. All I can think of is where they just reverse it in the actual saying, like, say, in Star Trek, Kira is her family name, and Nerys is her personal name. It's just that their names are reversed. It's not like you're calling her by her personal name first, although it sounds like that until it's explained to you. I'm trying to think of, I don't know of any societies where the family name's more reserved than the personal name.
No, that you could do that with aliens to make them more alien, right? Because that's very human. To have the family name be like circling the wagons, that's the outside layer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then only when you're really introduced to somebody as an individual rather than part of a group would you start to use their personal name. That would be a mark of.
And if you're really close, you get like nicknames, right? Like friend nicknames or lover pet names. I was also thinking about in the South, which I partly grew up in America. It's still very common for white people, at least in certain social classes, to incorporate to sort of counterbalance the taking the father's name with some of the matrilineal last names are put in as first names or middle names. Like I know people who have, their first name or their middle name, which is a surname from their mother's side of the family. Very common. There's also, of course, honoring living relatives. The first, son of the next generation might have the father's first name, middle name, and last name. And then be junior, the third, the fourth. I've known through the fourth generation.
It's completely different the way we do it.
And then there's patronymics, particularly in Norse Scandinavian societies, where yes, you've simply got the name of your father, but then often you would honor another family relative when you in turn had a child. So you end up with strings of, Olaf Magnusson, who was the son of Magnus Olafsson, who was the son of Olaf Magnusson, who was the son of Magnus Olafsson. That's not an uncommon thing.
Yeah.
But it's difficult for database programmers.
It's tricky.
And historical.
Iceland still uses patronymics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have a
The
friend
only place I know that does.
From that heritage, but is like third generation American, and his twin sons, the way he dealt with it was he gave the being an American, he did a compromise. He gave the middle name of the twin sons are his first name, both of them. So his first name is Thorin, and so it's such and such Thorin, last name, such and such Thorin, last name, and rather than say Thorinson as their last name. So that way he could handle both societies.
And then you've got people like George Foreman, who had 5 sons, all of whom were named George.
Sigh.
Well, and okay, so we're after 5 p.m., but I did want to actually mention one more thing, which is how do we decide when something merits a name? And so that's a completely different topic, perhaps, for another day.
Yeah. I mean, there's like El Nino, right? That's like a named phenomenon. Or
the names for storms.
Hurricanes, yeah. Tropical storms.
And now they're trying to name rivers.
I think I'm going to put that on our list for another day.
Can I add one more thing? Which is one of the quotes that came out of my Clarion class that actually made it to our T-shirt was a bit of advice, because we haven't much talked about alien names with made-up languages and how you would go about that.
Yeah, I think that may have been something that we talked about in previous naming discussions, but not.
But the bit of wisdom from the Clarion class, and I forget which classmate came up with this, if you can put new and improved in front of it, don't use it as an alien name.
It sounds like a product. All right. And on that note, I will say let's wrap this up for now. So we are going to have a guest coming. I don't think it's next week, but I think it's perhaps the week after. June 18th, we're going to have Sam J. Miller on the show. I'm very much looking forward to that.
Oh, nice. He's cool.
Yeah, he's cool. I met him at the Nebulas and I was like, you want to be on my show? So there you go. Anyway, so I'm looking forward to that. Perhaps we should do how do we decide when something merits a name next week. I am going to have to be a little iffy on the date of next week's hangout, however. Actually, no, let's not be iffy. Let's say it's going to be Thursday of next week. Here's the reason. My kid's last day of school is on Wednesday. And so the first 3 days of the week are going to be full of things. And I'm not sure how I will be getting through those 3 days. So I would like to do this next Thursday rather than next Tuesday. And thank you so much for your understanding. Anyway, I appreciate you all. It was a great discussion, and I'm going to stop our broadcast.